Hi, how's it going?
Hi. Hi, nice to meet you guys.
Hey, nice to meet you. My name is Mehdi.
Pleasure. I need to change my background. I play a tabletop role-playing game with my friends.
Oh, nice. Fun.
We're playing, well, I play two actually. So we're playing a D&D game, but we're also playing, there's a lesser known one. Are you familiar with Android from Fantasy Flight? That universe, like Netrunner? It's like cyberpunk.
Okay, nice. Speaking of, you've played it, the new Cyberpunk, right?
Yeah. Are you asking me?
Yeah, yeah. Thumbs
Yeah.
up, thumbs down.
I mean, thumbs up. They're gonna fix it. It's obviously it was totally broken on console. I had a great time with it on PC. It was good, but
I've
nothing can live.
I've stalled so far.
What?
I'm waiting for like the right experience to be fixed. I was like, you know what? I'll let them patch it for a while.
I think that's a perfectly legitimate way to go about it. Yeah.
Especially right now we have Valheim, so that's cool.
I've been so into Valheim. Yeah.
I mean, my God, I think the whole
It's an addiction.
world was, yeah. Sorry to obviously now we're talking about tech right now, but yeah, Valheim.
It's a form of tech. I think it's reasonable.
5 indie developers that are now millionaires.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic story, but like, yeah, when I first played it, I was like, okay, this is what the hype's about. Seriously, we saw these graphics in '95. Probably not '95, but something like that. It seemed pretty dated, like PS2 sort of graphics. And then as I played it longer, I'm like, okay, so it lacks some polish here and there, but it really respects the intelligence of the player. And then the simulation is actually pretty dang remarkable.
Yeah, I actually think the look and feel of it is such a subtle aesthetic choice. Like, I mean, obviously they were working within the limits of their development team to some extent, but it's actually quite a beautiful game. It's just not, it's not exact. So it doesn't have the kind of retro. It's a weird kind of retro. It's not like 8-bit chiptunes retro. It's like Ultima 12 retro era, or something like that. It's got a really kind of cool feel. But then the way they do draw distance and high dynamic range, I think is what that technique is called, like makes it look kind of like a little toy in the distance. Like there are obvious aesthetic polish to it that is really cool. I don't know, what I think is remarkable about it from a loot perspective is just like, there's no new, at least, I don't mean to sell them short on this because I think this is sort of what Blizzard in their heyday did. There's nothing new in this game at all. They just sort of removed all the stuff that people don't like. Yeah. And that's what. Hey, Yasirah.
Yeah,
hey, Trevor.
I think the pacing is really cool, and I think your description about the graphics is pretty apt. Like when you look at it in a whole scene perspective, like you're in the Black Forest. Sorry, Yasirah, we're talking about Valheim. You just need to start playing games with us again.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's like the Black Forest.
I kind of like expected it. I was kind of like, I don't want to introduce Trevor to these two guys really because I'll be the one who's not playing games.
Okay,
But
we'll keep it short. So my one real quick takeaway is like up close the graphics are not great, right? You see like sort of 2D sprite sort of effects kind of going on. As a whole, as a scene, it's incredible. Like you look at like the Black Forest, for instance, and I'm like, I am like literally hiking through the most overgrown forest in the Pacific Northwest. Like this is really cool, and it's all procedurally generated, like random angles of trees and crap sort of out, and it just sort of feels organic and real. That's incredible, given that it's an indie team.
That environment
systems are also cool.
Yeah,
like the smoke system, smoke simulation, structural integrity stuff. Like there's a lot of really cool systems at play. I was watching a video of a guy who went around and killed everything with campfires, which I didn't know you could do, but which is like a really kind of lo-fi way of, like he went through all the way to like the Elder and killed the Elder with campfires, which was ridiculous. But I don't know, just a lot of like systems at play, which are really cool.
Yeah, you were talking about the Black Forest. I think like it's so aesthetically beautiful. The because you have these bad guys in that region who are the little dwarf guys, and their eyes kind of glow. And then there are also these like will-o'-the-wisps in the trees that glow the same color. And then there are these glowing plants, these thistles that sort of glow the same color. And so you're in this dark, spooky forest, and you're relying so much on audio because you're jumping at these colors that pop out. And I don't know, that's like the kind of subtle, it's 5 people, but like that's really subtle, like those are really interesting and intelligent artistic choices made within the constraints that they were working under. And I respect the hell out of their creation.
Yeah, and it's a labor of love. Like you can tell a lot of care and attention has been put into it. Just like very deliberate choices, like not a lot of time wasted, it seems like, on superfluous stuff in that game. Like it just nailed the core systems.
Yeah, I mean, and like speaking of like the little will-o'-the-wisps, like the little light in the forest, there's nothing so like exciting as when you're trying to get home and you see like the subtle glow of your torches off in the distance, just like the subtlest, warmest glow. You're like, I think that's a base. Sweet, I can go towards the fire.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a really cool game. All right, so tech. That's why we're here, right? So yeah, first of all, Trevor, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Trevor. I'm a front-end web developer at a Bay Area startup called Mind. We are a property management company. Cool. So I make the software, I help make the software that our property managers use to manage their properties. Yasirah and I met a couple of years ago now and change, I think, in Lambda School, which is another Bay Area startup. Y Combinator thing, this guy, Austin Alred, and I always forget the name of, this is awful, but I always forget the name of the other guy. Who did he start? Who was his partner?
Was it Caleb? No?
Yes, thank you. So they started this school. Their story is actually pretty remarkable as well. One of them was like, I think he had to drop out of school. He went to school for computer science, had to drop out because he couldn't afford it, ended up living in his car trying to get his first job as a developer, and then, you know, was made a success of himself in this world, and then just wanted to make sure that money was never a barrier to entry for people entering into the world of web development again. So yeah, I don't know. I won't speak for Yasirah, but my life took a real hairpin turn after I went to that school, and it just totally changed my career. And now I really, 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 really like my life. And
yeah,
I like hanging out.
I want to hear the backstory on that, because she said you were a full-time actor before.
I was in yeah. So I grew up in Minnesota, and I won't go into like, I'll try to give you the real, you know, thumbnail sketch version of this. But basically, I was like a theater kid growing up, and there's a kind of mini show business in Minnesota because there's a theater there called the Guthrie Theater, and that meant that a whole theater scene sprung up in the Twin Cities, which means there's a lot of actors, which means there's like talent agencies, and there's this like tiny little industry there. And I'd gotten involved in that as a kid. Yeah, it's really kind of weird. I got involved in that as a kid. So like when I was 9 years old, I was like doing like Target and Best Buy commercials and like other kinds of things like
Nice.
yeah, other companies that are like based in the Twin Cities. And so then I didn't hear from them for like several years. When I was like 13 or 14 or something, I just forgot about it. And the summer before my senior year, there was this open casting call for this television show with like Nathan Lane and some other people. And it was like an NBC sitcom. And I just randomly booked this job. And like 2 weeks later, I was moving to California. And yeah, it was pretty crazy. So what was nuts about that is, you know, I'd never had any remote intention of becoming a professional performer of any kind. I love doing theater, but it was like never even a thought that, oh yeah, maybe I'll go move to Hollywood one day. My anticipation was I would go to college and study computer science. And
I didn't know that you're already interested on computer science, like from a long time ago. I thought like your computer science experience started with Lambda.
It did, but I was always interested. I didn't know any programming, but I got my first computer when I was like, I don't know, 9 or 8 or something. I'd always like messing around with technology. I've always been interested in how things work. It's just my life just took this really weird, a different hairpin turn before it hairpin turned back the way perhaps it was always meant to.
Yeah, she had kind of told me before that you'd never touched it before, and I was like, that seems surprising to go from like, I've never touched technology or programming, and I'm gonna jump into a boot camp, because it's like, that seems like you've already sort of like you've kind of whet your appetite, and you're like, hey, look, I want to learn as fast as I can to like kind of jumpstart this into a career. But it makes sense. I guess you'd already been kind of tinkering and stuff.
It was definitely crazy. Like I didn't know what a loop was. I remember on day 2 or something, I had to ask our mutual friend Ash what a div was. I was like, what's a div? I literally started with no knowledge about it at all. But I did start with I have a technical mindset. I like to learn things in a technical way. So yeah, I think I had the right kind of temperament, but none of the knowledge. So yeah, anyway, then I was in show business for a while. I quit because I didn't fit in. I didn't like that world. I tried copywriting. That was fine, but I just wasn't finding it fulfilling. So when I discovered Lambda School, I just tried it because they have this real like, or at least at the time, they had this real like, no strings attached. Like if you don't like it after 2 months or 6 weeks or something, you just leave and it's no big deal. And so I was like, all right, why not? So there's no money down, and if I can just leave, like whatever. And within a week, I was just like, this is the most interesting thing in the world.
That's really cool. I didn't know they did that.
No string attached. Like I think like they kind of started to do the like 2-week live boot camp again, Trevor. So that's just an entry point, right? You're not even in the program yet. Just 2-week, totally free boot camp, totally beginner. You just try it, and you like. Too many people are in the bootcamp, but it's live, so you kind of try your first div, your first HTML and stuff, and it's fun. I really enjoy it.
I did too. Yeah, they do this smart thing where they did at the time where it was like 2 weeks, and it was like once every night, I think, for like 2 hours.
Yeah.
And it was like you didn't even have to be there when they had it. Like they would record it and you could watch it later. You just had to sort of pass an examination at the end of it. And they do this they do this for like it's like a two-way screening process. One, it's for Lambda to ensure that you're remotely able to do this stuff at all. And it's also, I would say more importantly, more principally for the prospective student to decide, is remote learning for me? Is this kind of thing for me at all? And so I did that, and I remember it just being gruesomely difficult because orienting your brain to think this way is, I've always maintained this is a profoundly unnatural way to think. And
programming in general, or
programming in general, yeah, it really is not intuitive. It's not organic, right? Like it's not a human way to think about things at all. And so that's
interesting.
It takes a really, that's my opinion at least.
I'm really super curious about this because I've been in it for so long that like we start to take a lot of the stuff for granted. It becomes like breathing, and we can't describe the process of breathing at some point. It just like,
the fish doesn't know it's wet kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. And so number one, I'm curious, like the moment you like just sort of sat down to the first class and you're like, what the hell's a div? Like, were you scared? Were you like, oh, this is really cool what I can do with like these simple building blocks? Like, did it start to click right away, or did it seem like work?
It didn't seem like work in the sense that it didn't seem like a chore. I mean, it was always deeply engrossing and intriguing, but fear was always there as well. I mean, from my perspective, I'm like, I'm throwing a real weird Hail Mary, right? I don't know if this is going to work out at all. And I kind of have no good reason to believe that it will. Like other than my own intuition that this is interesting and there's no real downside for me continuing to pursue it like right now. The pieces definitely don't fit together right away. It takes time. I remember the comparison that I made at the time is, it's like being dropped off in the middle of a foreign country where you don't speak the language at all, but everybody is really, really helpful.
Yeah.
Right. So you're not scared exactly that you're going to die, but you are deeply discombobulated and disoriented.
Yeah. What interesting about Trevor too is that he built a bond quickly with another Lambda student. His name is Ash, and then Ash is like already this experience, and with years of experience, I think at that point, web developer. He's in India, but then like, Trevor bonded with him. Ash is like the best student and he knows everything and all, and Trevor kind of like, I don't know anything, kind of. But
yeah, it's funny.
It works.
You can't I can't tell that story without bringing him up. It's perhaps one of the luckiest things that ever happened to me. Like, so what happened is, in the first week, my head was spinning from like just the first week of instruction, just like HTML, right? And I decided to put together a study group just for anybody on the weekend who wanted to get together and like go over the previous week's instruction. Like, hey, did we like fill in each other's gaps in understanding? Sure. And Ash just showed up and started answering just all the questions. And I remember it was either that night or the next night, because we're 12 hours different. So he was like doing the night shift going to this school. And I remember like there were just many nights where I stayed up with him until, I don't know, 2 a.m. or something, just being like, yeah, but what does this do? Yeah, but why? Yeah, but how come? Yeah, but what about this part? And he would just answer every question indefatigably. And and so he was instrumental sells it short. I mean, I don't think I would have. He had just a really big impact on my comprehension of the material, but also I think the thing that I'm in the long term most grateful to him about is he taught me early on that the hate around JavaScript is bullshit and the hate around CSS is bullshit. That like
why Mehdi, you kind of chuckle there.
So that he's basically saying these are awesome and that the hate is just okay.
Yeah, like he turned me on to Udon.js like really early, and good sort of CSS practices and how CSS can be interesting. And I just see I'm glad that I avoided those pitfalls early on, because I see so many web developers who then like they're called upon to do front end work, and it's like they want it to be something different, and that's what causes so much of the agony for them. And if you like it's the kind of going against the grain of what those tools are meant to do and how they're meant to behave, rather than kind of what is the I'm going to do that. You must bend like the willow in the wind and not like whatever.
Yeah. Listen to this, Yasirah. CSS is your friend. That's
also kind of like universal in tech, though. It's like I feel like whatever your angle is, or whatever your angle of approach, or however you enter the tech industry, like there's always going to be some stigma associated with whatever it is that you're working on or doing, and there's always going to be these like turf wars, which are kind of like just completely counterproductive. Like ultimately, everything, like we all have the same goal. Like it's all kind of the same. It's more similar than different between programming languages, things like that.
I'll say this though, to kind of Trevor's point, I think your experience was probably largely very positive, because I honestly do feel like JavaScript community is slightly different than programming at large community, because there are lots of languages, and this is why JS gets a lot of hate, because it's not statically typed. It's like a free-form Wild West of a language. But JavaScript developers tend to be more creative types. We are the builders and creators, more or less, of the world as we know it, because that's the web. We also tend to be a little bit more inclusive, because it is the Wild West. We've all spent our hours and hours and hours Googling, trying to find the answers, just like everyone else. So we start to contribute back and give people the answers. And we don't tend to be quite as like closed and protective of our little sort of fiefdom in code, like some other languages tend to be. Like, so I do think that's part of it. Like, I really love JS developers. There are some trash programmers out there, but there's trash programmers in any language. But we really have some of the best, and then the most positive and collaborative ones, which I love that.
Yeah, I mean, I think JS is just strange. Like, it's well, what I like about it is how academic it is at bottom, like, and how weird and sort of forward thinking its early choices were, perhaps even unintentionally. I don't know. I'm not like up on my Brendan Ike history or whatever. That's his name, right? But I just think about that MPJ video I watched in Lambda School like a long time ago, when he was talking about functional programming, and he was just like, every language can do this, and he's like, let x equal 7, and every language can do this, like function add a b return a plus b, but not every language can do this, let x equal function a b return a plus b, and just the implications that flow from that one decision that make Redux and React and all of that stuff possible is like and then to choose the prototypal and referencing pattern instead of object-oriented patterns has been I just think the source of so many problems. Like, people come from, as web development explodes and Java developers come in, they're like, I want to make that money, and they go, what the hell is going on? And they attempt to project their patterns onto something that is fundamentally the opposite. I mean, this is Kyle Simpson's whole bag about like you literally can't get more opposite from object-oriented inheritance than prototypal referencing. And of course, it's like mixing oil and water when you try to like project those kind. But then, I want to get into. I'll stop ranting in a second. But because I work with TypeScript.
That's possible for you, Trevor.
It's not. I work with TypeScript all day, and I love TypeScript. And I just think it's like JavaScript is so cool and so flexible that it can be turned into the opposite of itself. Instead of a loosely typed, dynamic language. It's turned into a statically typed compiled language with object-oriented patterns and stuff like that. It's fascinating to me.
That's the part that feels dirty about it to me. I'm just like embrace the freeform. I get it. There are some wonderful things about TypeScript that I really do wish would just make it into the core language. I don't think they should be enforced as strictly as TypeScript. I think it should be more of an opt-in handcuffs. Like ESLint, you can have the most ridiculous ESLint rules, or you can just say, hey, look, I'm just only enforce a few little things. Semicolons really bug me, so I'll have an anti-semicolon rule, for instance.
We have that semicolon war here. So where do you stand,
There's no war. The
Trevor?
war is already won.
That's true. Well, what's your stance, Trevor? Semicolons or no semicolons?
Well, my
Two types of
latest,
people.
I'm with the no semicolon.
Make a wise decision, Trevor.
I'm with the no semicolon fad for the moment, but I only because the last thing I studied was Kent C. Dodd's Epic React course, and that's the way he does it. I'm kind of like, everything that you just said about JavaScript, like I fully agree, and everything that people say about TypeScript, I fully agree. Like I just kind of like everything, and so if you like,
that's like such a skill, by the way.
Yeah,
Or like such a good trait. It's just I just like everything.
I think it just comes, honestly, I think it comes from having done other things like before web development, and you realize like things can get so much worse than this, guys. Like, this is such an interesting, awesome like field, and like semicolons, no semicolons, I don't care. Like, do it. It's so much more important that it doesn't really matter if we drive on the left-hand side of the road or the right-hand side of the road. What matters is that we all drive on the same side of the road.
That's true. I will say, like if I go into a semicolon project, I will not introduce my non-semicolons. Like that's dirty.
Right.
But I will say, like, I don't like things that boilerplate for the sake of boilerplate. So anything that you have to put in there and it adds nothing to the readability, then like don't have it, right? White space, for instance, does add readability. We get sort of a hierarchical understanding of the program flow from that. Semicolons, like it's the same thing as a line break. So you already have this sort of concept of termination of a statement. There are a few exceptions, of course, to the rule. And I think that's one of the largest arguments that I've seen for using semicolons is, well, then you don't have to explain the two exceptions. Like this weird defining an array sort of thing where you have to like prefix the line with a semicolon. Like, come on. Like, I've never done that, ever. Hey, Mikhail.
Hey, Mikhail.
Okay, so that rant aside, I'm glad you're on team no semicolon. I think
for now.
Yeah, for now. We had kind of discussed like a tentative plan of build tools. Mehdi, did you have anything you wanted to like share on this or what? So as a quick background, we wrote this little NPM library called Itty Router, and it's been picked up by Cloudflare, sort of like their official little router for workers. And so I was like, okay, cool. We have to have a website for this thing now, right? So it can't just be like the NPM README. That's great and all, but hey, I have a lot more examples I'd like to share. It'd be much more usable in a site format, not just scrolling through a long README. So Mehdi was gracious enough to spin up a quick doc pages for it, and then we launched it using Cloudflare Pages itself, which is now live at itty-router.dev or .com. And it was a super easy transition for me. This was almost like the Heroku of sort of static site delivery. I was able to just point it to my repo, pick a branch, tell it which yarn command to run, and then which folder to go into. It took about 2 minutes to deploy, and then it's just live on the web. So Mehdi, you're much more familiar with this sort of world than I am. Why don't you share your thoughts on that? And anyone else that has some experience with like static site delivery these days, like definitely chime in.
Yeah, I don't have a slideshow or anything. I hope that's okay. But
I never do it. So
but
okay.
Yeah, no, but obviously, so like static sites are all the rage. Like Jamstack is kind of all the rage nowadays in front end development, which is kind of like a buzzword. But like recently, I've been experimenting with a couple of these new build tools. I don't know if y'all have heard of maybe Snowpack or Vite, which are kind of these like newer generation build tools for the front end. I can kind of actually share some stuff just because this is something that I feel like this is like a holy grail I've been chasing ever since we used to talk about parcel and like no config bundlers and all this kind of stuff. And this is a tool I've been using to spin up basically like front-end development environments really quickly. It's by the creator of Vue.js. If you're familiar with Evan Yu's work, this is like an Evan Yu authored front-end tooling toolchain, I guess. But there's also Snowpack. You might have heard of this one. This is also kind of similar. The main quality that these two tools have is that they rely on native JavaScript ES modules for dev, meaning there's no bundling happening, and your dev environment is like ridiculously fast. So one thing I really like about Vite, and if you've used Vue in the past, like the documentation is really excellent. Vite also has really, really good documentation. And this is actually what I used to spin up this doc site. So everything from support for things like web workers to support for styling preprocessors to TypeScript to various different types of frameworks and JSX, et cetera, is kind of all just supported by the framework. And there's like various plugins and things like that that you can install. And for the most part, it's pretty much like clone a template and go, or like bootstrap a project and go, and you don't really have to do a lot of configuration or thinking about it. And this is like amazing to me just because at work we use Webpack, and Webpack is, we're on Webpack 4. Webpack is very slow. We have a giant application, and you know, it takes on the order of like several seconds to rebundle everything, like all of the code, all of the JavaScript and CSS that's going to render our application every time we make a change in development. So I really wish we could use this at work, but yeah, I don't really know. Like, are y'all familiar with ES modules, and do you kind of know what this does?
Yeah, I mean, but so my question would be like, what are the downsides to this? Because obviously still a lot of the world's on CRA, which is Webpack based, unless I'm mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say for Vite in particular, and like Snowpack as well, is these are very new. So there's not as large of an ecosystem as something like Webpack or what have you. Now for build, actually, but like for production build, both of these tools actually rely on like a bundler like Webpack or Rollup to actually build your application. For the most part, you don't have to configure it, but some of the downsides are basically things that you would expect, like not as strong of an ecosystem, not like there's not much in terms of like built-in support for things like testing or linting. So you kind of have to just set those things up yourself. Something like CRA would be kind of like a, you know, like start, you know, like you create a new application, you already have a linter, you already have a test runner, you already have like a service worker set up, all these kinds of things. But aside from that, there's not really a whole lot. Like it's not easy to migrate to using a tool like this, because if you already have something that you're committed to, if you already have like this monolithic setup with an additional, like a different bundler like Webpack or something like that, obviously you need to, it's a big investment in time to migrate to a tool like this.
Sure.
But not a whole lot, you know, it's just kind of like, I think it's kind of what we've been building towards with things like ES modules and all these like cool new features that browsers have. So by just basically taking advantage of the platform and like newer features in browsers, you get a lot out of it. Mainly like hot module replacement for these tools is like on the order of like tens of milliseconds. Like you get your application reloaded with new code. Only the code you change is added back to the doc, like updated in the document, very, very fast. So like not a whole lot in terms of downsides if you're starting a new project.
Yeah, I would say that's first of all, am I loud enough? I'm seeing the meter not quite very loud, but
you could bump it up probably a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, so I would say that I would totally be willing to try these things. Number one, because I've not been a huge fan of Webpack over the years. It started to feel like not abstracted enough for developers. So a lot of these other newer ones are saying, hey, look, a lot of this stuff is assumed. A lot of this build cycle, or really, you care about your development environment loading instantly, and you care about your building a minified thing. Almost everything else is like, should just be sort of turnkey or assumed. So I'm okay with less of a community, less of the ecosystem, because the ecosystem is there to support this complete lack of prescription. And so I'm very eager for tools like, you know, Parcel. When it came out, I was super excited about it. I was like, this is like the one-liner to sort of run my development and get out a production module. It didn't quite deliver in that at the time. Fusebox seemed very inspiring as well. And since then we've had much sort of even newer and fancier tools. So I'm super excited to like try to say Slick, which is currently CRA with Webpack. It's a custom Webpack at this point. And try to migrate to one of these tools or several of them and just figure out which one's better.
Let me ask, so for Slick, you mentioned it's a custom CRA like Webpack setup. What do you do that's custom in Slick?
I couldn't tell you offhand. I know it's not a straight pass through because I never want to do some like node copying of files, like moving my own service worker into the dist, etc. And some small little tweaks like that. I think I modified some of the code splitting, but for the most part, it's pretty stock. So I don't think it would require a whole lot. And again, these days, since it's a static site delivered to Cloudflare, like I just need a folder, and that output needs to work. That's it. So, hey, Karina.
Hey, Karina.
Can I ask a question about this stuff?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, for sure.
So I work in part of it. The reason that I'm a bit lost is I work with Angular all day, and they have their own way of doing things. But so you guys are sort of talking about these tools as alternatives to CRA in some sense, like because CRA is a sort of out of the box configuration of these things.
Yeah, more or less.
It's an abstraction around Webpack. So it kind of streamlines the Webpack bundler experience with some other things like nicely baked in with some assumptions made. So it's a much easier development experience than like going out and handpicking all your little parts.
And so and now CRA is very opinionated also. Right. So it's like there's a lot baked into it basically.
Right.
And these tools are more like they're giving you a dashboard of levers and buttons to press for how you want to configure this stuff, or
it's more like a like a command line sort of thing, is at least how I use it. And so like there's sometimes some configuration, like you need to do some like config overrides or pass in some parameters or whatever, or tell it which folder to output to. For the most part, you can use it almost out of the box. Like you can use it as a run command where it'll scap out a lot of template for you with the commands to run, and then just never touch it. Like that works for a lot of people.
The reason I ask is like lately I've been, for the past couple of side projects, I've been trying to get polished up on React more lately. And I've just been using Next. And it seems like that also provides a good out of the box solution. And the deployment is ridiculously simple, at least if you go with Versal. And I'm curious about your comparison between, because I'm intrigued by things like Snowpack, but I'm just wondering like, why am I opting into that layer of complexity when I can create Next app, deploy it on Versal, done?
I think if you're happy with the next, oh, sorry, Mehdi, go ahead.
Oh yeah, sure. So I think like there's different scenarios in which you would want to use one versus the other. I would say like if you're building an application with React today, Next.js is a very solid choice. If you don't want to think about any of that stuff. So basically, a lot is given to you out of the box, things like server-side rendering or deploying to like a serverless provider and having your static pages rendered as static, having your server rendered pages rendered as like deployed to serverless functions. So Next really gives you a lot, and it's a full-fledged framework. So it's very opinionated. Like it expects a certain directory structure. It has a lot of assumptions kind of baked into it. One thing I would maybe, so like what I typically use something like Vite for, or like something like Snowpack or Parcel or whatever, is if I want to just create an index.html and like reference an index.js and just go, you know? And so like a lot of those things like CSS preprocessing or TypeScript or JSX or those things that you would typically have to configure something like Babel or a TypeScript compiler and you know, a bundler, all this kind of stuff, you don't have to worry about it anymore with something like Vite or Snowpack, but you don't get all those like framework goodies that make deployment easy. You're basically like left with a static site, which, you know, like depending on what you're doing, might be what you want. Depending on what you're doing, you might not want all of the extra stuff that Next gives you.
Right.
I would say like maybe Next is almost like the React equivalent of Angular these days, where it's much more on the rails, and you buy into a more or less a framework ecosystem. Like when you're designing a Next project, there's a lot of stuff that's actually specific to Next that's not just pure good clean React. This is actually one of the things that kind of kept me from jumping into it. I was like, look, I don't want to have to add a lot of stuff, and I want to be able to have this code look the same whether it's deployed via Next or Webpack or whatever else. Like I don't really care where it goes. I shouldn't have to see that in my code. And so Next has a lot of those opinions built in. If you're okay with that, then I would say ignore all this, right? You don't need to know the little micro bundlers. The moment you have to get off Rails, you're going to be like, ooh, well then what do I do? And so I like these tools because they give you the complete freedom of where it goes, which means you're not locked into any vendor, any particular framework. If a new service springs up the next week that streamlines it even further, you can just jump on it. There's nothing to sort of unbake from your code.
It's interesting. There's an interesting trade-off here. It's like you're talking, I think you're talking about the complaints that people probably quite rightly give about Angular, in that there's a lot of context-specific language stuff, right? Like you just have to memorize ng4, and that's never going to be useful anywhere else. And there's good static props, you know, and all that stuff for next and stuff that doesn't apply to anything else. So you pay that tax, but what you get in return is I don't have to think about the tooling or, you know, the deployment stuff at all. Whereas it sounds like what you guys are describing is there is no context-specific stuff. You can just have this sort of guts exposed HTML and JS file, but you do kind of have to understand a lot of the tooling and the underlying stuff that puts it together.
I think an analogy I saw on Twitter some years ago was, it's kind of accurate. I came from Angular at first too. I came from like the early alpha of Angular, in fact, through Angular 1 point whatever, and then switched to React at the 2.0 change.
You mean, sorry, I'm a little bit weird on the nomenclature. Do you mean Angular JS or do you mean modern?
Yes, Angular JS, like the original, the OG. And it was really powerful and really, really magical. Like I loved it. I liked that declarative style of mixing like these sort of commands right into my HTML. But this quote was, Angular tends to make great Angular developers, React tends to make great JavaScript developers. And I would agree that to a point, because you didn't have to really understand core JavaScript to some degree to sort of use these templates in Angular and stuff like that. Now, it always helps, of course. Like, you're going to be much more powerful Angular developer if you know truly in and out of the language. But it's a lot of config. It's a lot of like kind of weird patterns of your registering modules, your injecting dependencies, etc., like that. And it's very specific to Angular. And you go to React, and yeah, there's some nuances as well. Like JSX is a very weird concept for most people, and it was super weird for me as well. But at the end of the day, it's just I'm defining functions, just simple functions, and then I'm passing them around, and they're being injected as variables elsewhere through the app. And so I felt like, yes, while you're a little bit more nuts and bolts, number one, React felt exactly like what I ended up doing with Angular, which was writing my own custom directives. I was like, this is the power of it, right? I get to write my own element, and then I get to sprinkle it throughout the app and have its magic and its business logic sort of take over internally. So that's a React component, straight up. But then I didn't have to worry about some of this sort of like weird, if I add a module or dependency, I've got to inject it 4 places in my code. Yeah. I'm just like, well, it's just a file, and I'm going to call it when I need it. And if I don't need it, I just remove that import, and it's all
some
done.
of those problems persist in modern Angular. Like module files are still abstruse, but I would push back a little in that, like, dependency injection is not a language specific pattern, right?
Absolutely
like that's a thing.
No.
And it's handled now through RxJS, which for my money, and I'm still a bit wet behind the ears, but for my money, RxJS is the most interesting thing I've ever been exposed to in programming. I'm sure there's other interesting stuff out there. It's really cool.
I would even say, like, like the more I've worked with React and like modern React, quote unquote, and like hooks and things like that, I would argue that like what I perceived before as like React just being just JavaScript is no longer really a reality anymore. And like the hooks API in React is basically like teetering into a lot of domain specific stuff as well. So like I kind of get that. It's a mix, and like I find use effect, for example, being like the most problematic thing in terms of like React code for engineers who aren't used to writing a lot of React, or just newer to programming. It's like very, very confusing. A lot of potential pitfalls.
I had those same issues in Angular, and this is not to say that React does it any better at all. I think it's a common flow problem in just app design, no matter the framework or language. The concept of a use effect or like digest cycles in Angular and stuff like that. Like, I can't tell you how many like hurdles I ran into in Angular, and I of course done the same thing in component mounting of React. But
it gets at this really interesting deep problem that I'm like engrossed with right now. I watched that I forget this guy's name, which is a shame, but the guy who wrote React Query, I watched his talks, and he has these just deeply insightful points about side effects and what we're really worried about when we're worried about state management in front-end applications. We're worried about ensuring our client is in sync with our backend. And these are handled through a series of side effects. And the way RxJS is going to control those side effects is similar. It rhymes with the way that useEffect handles these side effects. And I don't know, I've also been playing around a lot with Firebase. And Firebase attaches everything to sockets. And so it's just interesting how different syncing patterns totally change your UX problems. So when all of my data is flowing from my database on sockets, I suddenly don't have a lot of problems with loading indicators and error states and all these things that I would have to think about in a different context. It's like really fascinating, that React Query talk. I recommend it. Like, his insight into UI state and side effects, how they're linked in this way that seems obvious when he talks about it, but I'd never really thought about it that way before.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think like oftentimes when we think about evolution of anything, right? Whether it's a state management, for instance, or whatever else, we think incrementally. We think, okay, what do I have now and how do I make it slightly better? Something like Firebase or whatever, they say, really, what do we want? And this is exactly what you described, which we want some sort of state and we want it to sync up and be appearing in the UI. We don't care how it got there. In fact, we just want it to be easy and seamless, easy for the developer to write it. So it needs to be real lightweight. And then fast for the user that's consuming it. Like, nothing else matters. How you did it can be anything. Now I am kind of curious how we do things like number one, when I started doing to socket driven CMSs, mind changing. It's super fast.
Sorry, what's a TMS?
CMS, like content management system. Yeah. So like an admin, right? Or whatever, where it's socket driven rather than REST driven. I still don't know how to integrate that, and that's just because I haven't done enough research with the serverless world. So, you have a static site and you don't have a microservice running somewhere to open a socket to. How do you run that with things like workers, serverless functions, etc.? But that's just my open-ended question, because I want to get back into it, and I'm just kind of like, well, maybe you can. I'm sure you can, but I don't have the answer.
Maybe Yasirah knows. I feel like Yasirah knows. She's got that look in her eye.
What knows what?
Sockets plus serverless. How do you do it?
Socket plus serverless.
Isn't like aren't Cloudflare durable objects like a solution for this? Because I actually signed up for the beta as well, because I've been like masterminding this. I've been trying to figure out how to build a peer-to-peer like diagramming tool, basically, without having to host a server of my own, or like using just serverless stuff, right? And I know it's not like serverless is just someone else's, but it's more the idea of like peer-to-peer enables patterns where you don't have to have like a server that's running a bunch of holding a bunch of WebSocket connections open or something like that. So with peer-to-peer and WebRTC, there's this exchange that has to happen. There's a bunch of exchanges that have to happen where you're basically opening a WebSocket connection. The two peers are exchanging a bunch of different things until they ultimately settle on like the makeup of their peer-to-peer connection. And then your WebSocket can just close and just go away. That's not really a good problem for serverless, but when I was looking at the Cloudflare durable objects marketing page, that was like one of the use cases, was like a real-time chat app or a real-time collaboration app. So I was actually wondering like how that would work, if that would enable basically like quote unquote serverless WebRTC patterns.
Well, I've been rejected from that same beta, so I can't tell you. I think
if my use case is good enough, I'll give you my account.
Right, I've been begging. I'm like, hey guys, you're using Itty Router. Can I like trade that for durable objects beta? They said no.
Is the use case that you're like wondering about is like, say you have a static site, kind of like a blog, but then it's hooked up to a CMS. User types in a new blog article and you want it to pop up instantly? Is that
no, not even that. Like, so, well, yes, that would be of course ideal. Like, sort of push from some sort of like remote back to clients that are connected. But even just like, I want to update an article and hit update, right? So if you had a constant socket running, well, you don't have to like build a REST request and send it across and wait for that sort of latency. You just push it through the socket, and the message, and the server accepts it and adds it to the database, right? So it's just much faster for database reads, writes, etc. With this particular thing, it's like when you load the web page, it fires a whole bunch of requests for each individual asset. Every single thing in the site is an individual worker request to a random function. They're all different. They assemble the site. There's nothing that's open, right? So when I go and ask for something else, there's no connection that's still open. There's no session. None of that sort of concept exists. It's just like it's going to a brand new worker each and every time. And so like that's how I don't understand how a socket could work, because that requires a persistent connection. You've basically engaged in a handshake. From the moment you first load that site, it gets you a handshake and says, hey, we're still listening. So we can now use this channel to communicate, but that doesn't work with a worker because it fires up and dies, in milliseconds.
Yeah, there's a few other, like basically anything that involves a persistent connection is like, that's a big gap in like the serverless ecosystem right now. You could also think of things like peer-to-peer is I've been doing a ton of reading on WebRTC, so like peer-to-peer is just where my mind goes, but even things like game servers or for web-based games, things like that, where you need a persistent server. You need a server that's going to be like constantly running and able to hold these open connections. And that kind of defeats or that kind of goes against the grain when it comes to just typical like serverless deployment patterns, where you don't care about, like your invocations are not stateful in a sense. They're just, you basically give it a function and say, hey, run this function when you get a request, an incoming request, and like produce an output, but you don't necessarily care about how many instances are running, what state they're keeping. It really comes down to statefulness. And so that's kind of a big gap with serverless right now, is you can't really build stateful services. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that looks like also, because like durable objects is the only thing I've seen that tries to tackle that problem in a way where it feels very much like you're still deploying a serverless quote unquote service.
I guess it depends on what you mean by serverless, right? Like if you mean like a Firebase cloud function, which like it sort of sounds like what you're describing, Mehdi, like it fires once and then it's done or whatever. But if you just mean a deployment on some computer that isn't yours, that remains always listening,
it's the first for sure.
Right.
It's basically a function that like fires up and dies and has no way to communicate with some sort of master. Like it can't communicate with the others or some sort of stateful session to say, oh, like we know that there are 13 users right now. Like a worker literally is serving a request. When you ask for a JS file.
It sounds like the two things that you're describing are just like the sort of conceptual opposites of each other. Like I don't think it actually,
they are.
They kind of are.
That's the struggle, because we want the power of both. Like for instance, with serverless, it's terrific. So in Slick, for instance, this is a sort of a Dropbox backed image gallery, kind of like an Instagram clone. And I would run into this thing when I would do a microservice like Express based, where you went to a fresh installed thing. You have no assets loaded, whatever, and it asks for 100 images. Well, it's going to that Express server and it's asking for 100 images all at once. So it starts to throttle and bottleneck and choke up while it tries to serve 100 fresh assets, download them from S3 or whatever it's going to do. Serverless doesn't have that, because each request goes to a separate function. Each function says, I have one task. It's to get one image, download it, deliver it, cache it, whatever I'm going to do. And so like it's sort of infinite scaling, which that's a huge amount of power, right? You don't have this concept of it all being like piped through like a soda straw. You have a million soda straws. But the downside is we lose some of that power of things like that handshake, that tunnel that a socket gives us of just straight speed. You're like, okay, great, I've got 100 soda straws, but what's faster than giant pipeline that, nothing has latency, which is kind of like the socket, right? You don't have to you don't have that maybe extra 80 milliseconds tacked onto each and every database request because it's already connected waiting. There's no headers to send. There's no extra crap. Yeah. So I want them both.
is your thinking that there is a way to walk this tightrope, or because my gut tells me this is just a trade-off that you have to accept, but I don't know what I'm talking.
I don't either.
I don't know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So I dropped a blog article also in the Zoom chat if y'all want to take a look. But this is this durable objects service from Cloudflare is the only thing I've seen that kind of tries to take this on right now, if that makes sense, right? Like even like reading through this, their killer app is basically what I want to build. So it seems very much like this is the thing that's trying to walk that tightrope, if that makes sense. Now, how it behaves in practice or how ergonomic it is to build services around something like this, that kind of remains to be seen, I suppose, because this is like in closed beta. I haven't had a chance to try it. I know Kevin's been wanting to, but you know, like I think you're right in that it feels like the two ideas are fundamentally at odds. But at the same time, I really want someone to just completely change that belief, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because the idea of it is very nice, right?
I'll say this: I'm on the workers Discord, the Cloudflare workers Discord, and it is approaching open beta, so that's exciting. They've basically said good luck on getting into the closed beta. It is really exciting, and I have full faith that this community, which is very active, will like tear apart the way we think about serverless. And durable objects may honestly be the gateway. Now, what I've seen so far is pretty rough, but just like anything with workers, people will quickly write abstractions and make that developer experience much better than whatever just raw code they give us out of the gate. But I mean, I've done enough demos now with Cloudflare workers. Like I can deploy a serverless function in like 5 seconds, including Webpack build time, and have it live on the web. Like, and these things like they blow AWS and GCP and Azure functions out of the water in terms of performance. So if anyone can do it, I think Cloudflare can absolutely do it.
That's really intriguing.
Yeah. In that article that I linked, and I guess if you're watching this, you don't have that link in front of you, but you can look at the introduction, just like look up the introduction for durable objects by Cloudflare. But the last little bit is very interesting. So like, literally like the last couple of paragraphs, they describe when you're thinking about serverless, and fundamentally like serverless, we think of serverless as stateless. Their approach is that if we think of serverless as stateless code, like a function, like a serverless function, then durable objects are like a serverless, they're like serverless state, if that makes sense. So like the state is the bit that's being split into fine-grained pieces. I think that's like what they describe. But like basically like the unit of work is not the function, but the state itself.
Think of how
which is mind-bending.
Think of how antimatter this is to a REST architecture, right? It's push instead of pull. It's stateful instead of stateless. It's not a computer you don't completely control. I guess there's not a way in which it's going to be more different, it seems to me.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, to me, it still goes down to what do we want to achieve, which is what you described in the beginning, Trevor. It's like some sort of data, some sort of state lives somewhere, and all we care about is that our UI reflects that state.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and we want the simplest path to get there.
Yeah.
So like we're used to the REST patterns because we've been doing it for years, and it's just sort of like it's comfortable with us, right? We understand it. We can just say, okay, well, I start off with a UI, it has nothing. I need to get a list of something. So I query my API, I get a list of things, and I render it out. But really, I don't want to have to make that call each and every time. I just want to say, hey, look, I'm looking at this resource, and it just tells me stuff. If someone else adds something to that resource, I don't want to have to ask for it or pull for it or some sort of like other barbaric like concept, which we currently do. I just want it to appear. This is one of the great things about sockets, which I did love. I could have multiple clients all sort of sending messages to each other, no problem. And that was really cool and magical and makes for great demos. But yeah, ultimately, I don't care.
That's why I do like a lot of pulling on your app. Do like all the pulling for each of the resources you need.
I hate polling.
Say that to Mehdi.
I hate polling. Mehdi, if you're doing it, I mean, we all do it, but it's just
polling is not. Yeah, no, I agree with you. Barbaric is kind of a weirdly accurate. Like it feels hacky when you're doing it and wasteful because it is.
Right.
But the problem is that sockets implementation by themselves are unreliable. It's like I actually had this experience where we have an owner app and it's got chat things, and we had a long polling solution, and I was tasked. I was like, why aren't we doing this with sockets? And all my front end engineers who have more experience than me, they were like, because WebSockets kind of suck. And so I had to look into Pusher and like other third-party things. I mean, one of the reasons why I think Firebase is cool is because you just delegate the responsibility of keeping those sockets stable to Google. And I but yeah, and managing yourself is, you feel like you can't put a socket in without a long polling backup, in which case you just doubled the complexity of your code. And like, why are you doing this then?
Yeah, or you use something like Socket.io that I'm pretty sure like falls back to polling or something like that. Which again, I'm fine with abstractions. I've written the WebSocket stuff myself. Even with Socket.io, it's not trivial because you still have to manage like making sure those connections drop and stay dropped, like clean up so you make sure you don't have like permanent memory leaks and all that sort of crap. It's not easy, and then yes, sometimes they also just failed. So like it was a little bit harder to understand. Whereas long polling, just gonna work typically. But to me, that's like the child that asks, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" And you're like, you get really annoyed really fast. And you're like, this child has asked 1,000 times, and I've only
that sounds like
ever.
My daughter.
Right. And you're like, this is just not the most efficient way. I don't need to be sending like all those requests add up. You're paying for them. All that bandwidth you're paying for. Someone's paying for it. It's probably going to be on your statement as the developer or whoever's hosting the thing. But
I want to talk to Yasirah's kids grounded for long polling their mother.
So I'm hoping we can solve that.
That's really Amina. Are we there yet? Are we there yet?
Yeah, you're asking tons of times for essentially no updates typically. I mean, maybe you've gotten your polling interval just perfectly, or you have such a high traffic site that, hey, your 5-second poll is totally accurate and you're always gonna have an update. That's wonderful.
Is this just a consequence of is this one of those things where like somebody's choice in the early days of the internet could have zigged instead of zagged and it'd be totally different? Like we picked the HTTP protocol and it's a pull protocol. I'm sure there were good reasons. I don't know enough about the history of this stuff. I'm literally certain the smart people who were doing that had good reasons at the time. But it does seem like when you're thinking about this problem, like we have state stored in a safe location, we want it to be pushed. Like push seems like the obvious choice in retrospect, and yet we took the opposite approach. It's not like that in other protocols either, right? Like if you have like the video games don't suffer from this problem exactly. I mean, they suffer from a whole suite of other problems, but like what does anybody know enough about the history of the internet to know why that choice was made? Is this a stupid question? I mean, I feel like it must be obvious.
Yes, it's a pretty dumb question. I'm just kidding. It's terrific. And
I definitely don't know enough to answer this question from like historically, but one feeling that I get, or one sense that I get is kind of when it comes to web development and like web applications and using the web as an application distribution platform, it's a relatively new thing. And I feel like a lot of what we've built so far is really kind of built on repurposed technology, including like the raw fundamentals of everything we build on the web, right down to HTML. So like, I almost wonder if it's just like an artifact of that. Like what will this look like in 15 years?
And there's an important note there. Like that's about API design. So these people 20 something years ago that are creating this, that had that very good reason at the time, it was probably a reason that they foresaw as being relevant at that period in time, and probably even the foreseeable future. And now we're looking at it and saying, hey, look, it's a little bit backwards.
The architecture of sharing academic papers between Stanford and Chicago was like maybe not what exactly was not suited for Google Maps or something, like.
Sure, but also equally incredible that it can now be repurposed in this sort of backwards fashion that we have today to achieve all the incredible things we've achieved with those pretty awkward fundamentals. I hope that the next version, whatever it is, maybe it's push, hopefully, has that same sort of like abstractness to where people can repurpose it for decades later, to great benefit.
Interesting.
Is that like then to say, when you refactor things and you kind of see like, okay, this is like starting to get a little awkward, and then clean it up. Don't just like add to it. You know what I mean? Like now you're already in a pile of this mountain of awkwardness, and to go back and build from scratch is too big.
I think, yes, absolutely right. So it's also about a buy-in, right? So they've created this thing. If they change those low-level building blocks now, or at any point, once people start to adopt it, the entire web breaks. Therefore, they can't, right? And that's just why it's been stuck on this pattern. They can introduce new concepts in addition to basically feature additions, but they can't just break that API,
right.
So it's just not going to change. So it's really more about clever API design or component, whatever, framework, language design, whenever you start, that says, I'm gonna hopefully achieve the task I want to achieve, but I want to keep as many handcuffs off so that this can be repurposed forever. It's kind of like Minecraft. I'm pretty sure when they built Minecraft, they had no concept that people would build literally entire worlds out of it. Valheim will probably be the same sort of thing. Like we have a very simple concept, and it's kind of open-ended. You can do whatever you want with it. You can build even gianter things or whatever. That's not really a word. You can build huge things. Like Little Big Planet was another thing like that. It's just kind of like we have some physics, and here's a sandbox. Go forth and build. So
it's the power of combinatorials. I don't know if any of you have ever read Steven Pinker's books on language, but he talks about there are only 26 letters of the alphabet, right? But through those finite set of characters, we get this crazy infinite. Not effectively infinite, but technically infinite set of possibilities. I don't know. What Yasirah said was really interesting. Like, you think about the internet as this hack on a hack on a hack on a hack. And if you were to analyze the architecture of the internet like you'd analyze a code base, you'd be like, start over.
Right.
It's like an unmaintainable bird's nest. But somehow all of that chaotic mess creates the sort of primordial ooze of like combinatorial pieces from which from this chaotic energy, like interesting ideas emerge. Sorry, Yasirah, you were gonna say something.
I was just saying like I gotta go another design meetings, but nice
we ran a little bit late.
Meet you again, Trevor. Talk to you soon.
Yeah.
And you too, Kevin and Mehdi. Bye.
Bye, Yasirah.
Bye, Yasirah. Yeah. So I didn't mean to run you guys late. Sorry.
No. It doesn't really matter. I'll cut it off at some point, just because I've got other meetings that will back up on this. But it's just I love these kind of concepts because I think a lot of people just don't even talk about them, right? They just sort of take it for granted. It is what it is, and they don't even understand like why it got there or how you can change it for the future. Not that we can probably be the ones to change it for the future, but
hey, don't sell yourself.
That's true. But we do face these things on a day in and day out basis. When we create a module, a library for work, for ourselves, that we intend to repurpose, we can start to make these decisions that say, look, instead of making like the razor blade, it's like it is the most, or maybe like Swiss Army knife, right? It's the thing that does everything for you. It's like, maybe just make the perfect knife and just say, here's a knife. You'll use it in your Swiss Army knife. You can add it together and make a throne of knives, like in Game of Thrones. You can do whatever you want, but you can like literally just make a singular purpose very, very cool. I made this mistake with a previous library called API Cache. It's an API caching library, and I started to say, oh, this is really cool. I'm excited that people are collaborating with me. So they add Redis support, they add this support, they add Restify support, and ultimately, I'm now married to supporting all that sort of crap, which means it's now a barge that I can't just quickly shift. And nor can it really be the fundamentals, the bones for much more elaborate powerful things. Whereas if I just made like a very simple, pure function, like, some of Syndra Storehouse's like is functions, like is true. Don't know why people need that, but it's in like millions and millions of repos because it does a single task really well. I like simple little building blocks now, and I find myself gravitating towards simple libraries that do a single task really well. to big complex ones. And I would see that the fundamentals of the internet, like even HTTP protocol, is one of those like simple building blocks that
there should be some kind of principle that like establishes the value of a single thing having one responsibility of some kind.
Yeah, it's almost like that exists somewhere.
I wonder what we would call it.
Yeah. But yeah, it's just so much easier to wrap your head around that kind of stuff. But
yeah, I agree.
Anyway, Mehdi, thank you for sharing the snowpack and stuff like that. I'm gonna dig into that and maybe do like a live work session at some point when I try to migrate Slick from CRA to just give me a list of possible build systems that might be better that can still output a static site, and I'll tear it apart because I'm not married to CRA. Like, it's fine to get the job done, so there's not been a lot of priority in ripping it out right now, but
yeah, I mean, there's also nothing inherently wrong with
no, but I do love
that came out less than or like more than 1 year ago.
What?
I'm just saying, like, you know, it's CRA is still great.
No,
right?
It absolutely is, and I'm not dogging CRA. Like, it really does power a lot of the web at this point, like a lot of React projects. It's just I like exploring kind of like the cutting edge, and I've always been sort of chasing this sort of ideal developer experience of I get more for less. I'm lazy as a developer, and to achieve a lot with minimal effort. I don't want to have to read config files and, you know, create a whole bunch of commands and stuff like that. I don't want to have to manage as complex of a package JSON as I do these days. So I just want it to be easy. Maybe I should just switch to Next. No, I'm just kidding.
It's not a bad call. I do love me some Next.js. Like if a client came to me today and was like, "Hey, will you build me an app and it needs to have like 5 pages and it needs to do X, Y, and Z," I would probably reach for Next.js because I don't want to spend a lot of time messing around with, especially, I mean, well, it depends, right? If I'm billing by the hour, I would spend all the time messing around with the bundler.
You would switch to Angular or Vue or something, right?
Right. Yeah, like several times. No, but you know, that's kind of the idea. If you have a time constraint, like you don't really want to spend your time figuring out, oh, what rollup plugins do I need to compile my TypeScript for it to run, you know?
And that was my problem with Webpack in general. With the migration from 3 to 4, unless you were on CRA, which abstracted it and like just hit it all under the hood, I don't want to have to pick out a million plugins to say, oh, I want SaaS support, right? Or less support. Like, shouldn't some of this be assumed these days? Like, I want some of these niceties.
I think the problem is, so yeah, I fully agree with Mehdi that I don't really get what Next can't do right now. At least that's my naive feeling. But I think the problem is less with respect to like config and managing complex package JSONs and all that stuff. It's less the old stuff than it is the new stuff. Like the churn of web development that people perhaps quite rightly complain about is the price you pay for things constantly getting better, right? Like the tools that we have right now are better even than when I was first introduced to them. You know, when I first learned React, we didn't have hooks. Well, React post hooks is better, right? Yes. It took time to learn, but like, it's just so I don't, you know, like I'm kind of figuring that out, like trying to put together React applications now, and like, how do I want to configure my jest, and how do I want these scripts to run, and how do I want? Well, the reason that jest is difficult, or the reason that I'm opting into some complexity configuring jest is because I'm using you know, React testing library. Well, that's an optional step, but it's just better than the alternative. And the same thing with like, there's a way to tie in the React testing library syntax into Cypress, which means that I don't have to context switch when I'm writing those different tests. So that's another layer of complexity in the config, but it's just because there was an incremental step forward, you know. So I don't know, at least that's my limited experience with why you can't just automate this stuff. It's because in 6 weeks, there's going to be some cool new idea.
I agree. And to some degree, that's the price we pay as developers, right? We say to chase the bleeding edge, I have to have those sort of like expose the nuts and bolts because I will be tweaking it or whatever else. But then at some point, like we switch into but I just want to build something. I have an idea. I just want to build it really fast. And so you're like, I don't want to have to pre-configure 20 things or jump into whatever the latest repo I did that sort of had all the things kind of wired up and just clone that thing. Like it always feels kind of like a dirty first step when you're like, really? It's like, I don't even care about the dev process at all. I literally want to open my editor, start coding, and have it magically appear somewhere at some point with testing and all that sort of like support automated. Like we just sort of, we say, but it has been like this. We open the command line and we run these commands and we, do all this sort of stuff. We just take it for granted that like this is just what it is, but I don't think it has to be. And so anything that gets magically closer to that I literally have no steps. I open my editor and start coding. I will be chasing. It's like, it's like if you want to improve transportation, like, well, let's take a car and let's make the wheels more efficient. Well, no, the real thing is I want it to be from here to there in as short and safe a time as possible. That's it. So everything in between is completely like up for grabs.
It just reminds me of the have your cake and eat it to like feeling that I got with the serverless and the sockets. Like there's a I'm gonna butcher this, I'm literally certain, but there's a Japanese proverb that says when you accept a favor you give up your freedom, and there's something like that with abstractions, right? Like the magic that you want is gonna take your freedom away. And that's like, to me, that just is a fact of life, almost.
I love that.
I agree. And so number one,
plaster that all over the AWS Lambda marketing page.
And it's certainly, but at some point, like, I'm okay with that, right? It's like, you're okay with giving, like, I write abstractions. I love doing more for less, which means I'm always writing a slightly better abstraction to whatever was delivered to me. Knowing that, yes, it's not going to handle every edge case, and I'm not trying to get it to handle every edge case. Those are the building blocks. That's the HTTP protocol, sort of thing. That can hopefully handle almost everything, because they're like, look, you build all the layers that will then be trashed and burned along the road. Like, we're not going to do it. But yeah, I don't know. At this, like, I'm always torn between chasing build and trying to like, oh, what's cooler, what's faster, what does better hot module reloading, whatever else. And then at some point I'm like, I could redo this in every new language, framework, build everything, and I still have accomplished nothing. I haven't built a damn thing, right? I've built Hello World or a to-do list in every language imaginable. But at some point, I have to actually just build the idea.
Yeah, I mean, I've had that feeling many times, starting up a side project and going like, day 3, just configured, jest or found the random TypeScript config line I need to put in or whatever. But then I reflect on, the reason that I'm in this situation is because I wanted to do all these cool things and I like them. I bring, first man must realize he is the cause of much of his own suffering.
That's another good one. Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Like, I love it. And I think the moment we stop and we just say, let's say you're on Angular, you say, well, I can move really quickly in Angular. So why would I learn anything else? Well, if Angular is not the direction of the web, you've now painted yourself into a corner. And you'll always have a job updating Angular code, 20 years from now, when Google has like abandoned it a decade ago. You'll be like, I still have a job and they pay me lots of money because I'm like 7 people on earth that can still do this. But you won't be at that sort of creator edge. And so, like, to me, I love being at the creator edge, which means I'm always looking for the pulse of, hey, what's going to replace JavaScript? I love it. I've loved it for decades now. But it's not the last language, of course. Something will come along that will just destroy JavaScript and be like, oh man, remember the dark ages back when we used this thing called JS? And the only way you keep a pulse on that is by playing. So
yeah,
I don't know. Either way, I love the sport. We got to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us, Trevor.
My pleasure. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Yeah,
pleasure was all mine.
And we're glad to have you in development.
Oh yeah, thank you. I've never felt happier in a world that I've been in. So
I love it. Here. And I also heard, this is just a side note before we wrap up, that you and Yasirah are like mentoring refugee camps in Iraq now.
Yeah, that's a
whoa. What?
That sounds like one of those things that like Matt Damon says to Oprah or something.
Right.
But yeah, my friend Brandon from way back, he got hooked up with this, and he just told me like, yeah, they need mentors. There's a bunch of Kurdish refugees and a few Syrian ones that this really cool organization called Recoded, that's RE:coded. And they've got donations, I guess. They're nonprofit. And yeah, there's a bunch of like really smart, driven people who just need work and they're trying to learn to be developers. And Yasirah and I are going to go talk to them and just try to talk to them about what it's like and give them advice to whatever capacity that we can. I'm more confident in her ability to do that than mine, but we'll see how it goes.
She said the opposite. She's like, oh, it's gonna be so much easier with Trevor there.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, no, I'm very curious to hear about your experience with that, because I would certainly be interested in participating in something like that.
I could hook you up with, yeah. I could definitely give this woman your contact information if you like. Hit me up on. I mean, how do we contact each other outside of this Zoom?
Twitter. Call my agent. I'm just kidding. I don't.
Plug your Twitter. Like this is like our plug your Twitter.
I actually know about a thing or two about agents, so. Yeah, I don't know. We'll figure it out.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, I mean, I think coding is like the enabler of the world, and for the people that like love it and it's like they can deal with that sort of puzzle language of it, it's like it can open all sorts of doors. Like you can not only create the future, but you can get paid for it to basically play for a living. Like I feel like a kid in a toy box all the time, and somehow make a living. So
sometimes when I'm elbow deep in a TypeScript compilation error for RxJS, it doesn't feel exactly like play, but
because it's TypeScript. I'm just kidding.
Fair point.
Just kidding. Play more. All right. Well, I'll get your contact information from Yasirah, and we'll be in touch for sure. And certainly feel free to join us anytime.
Yes, please.
I'd love to. Yeah, this was really fun. It's nice to meet you both.
Thanks, Trevor.
Bye.
Thanks, Mehdi.
Take care.